At my nephew's graduation party, my family introduced me as the one who never amounted to anything and was still trying to figure out her career at 35. When my brother loudly announced I was basically unemployed, while I secretly commanded a classified Pentagon unit with nuclear authorization codes, I thought the humiliation couldn't get worse. But when the Secretary of Defense's emergency call interrupted dinner and the White House Situation Room went silent as he said, "General, your orders?" my family realized their failure was actually the youngest four-star general in U.S. military history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Colonel Victoria Hayes, and at my nephew's graduation party, my family called me a failure while I secretly held nuclear authorization codes as the youngest four-star general in U.S. military history. When the White House Situation Room went silent, and the Secretary of Defense said, "General, your orders?" my family finally understood what their unemployed daughter had actually become. For most of my adult life, I was the family disappointment who couldn't explain why. Not because I had actually failed, but because my real achievements were so classified that I had to let my family believe I was a career disaster. While my siblings built impressive civilian careers they could brag about at dinner parties, I built a military record so sensitive that most of it would remain classified for 50 years. We grew up in the affluent suburbs of Colorado Springs, just outside the Air Force Academy, though my family never imagined how prophetic that location would become. My father, Dr. Robert Hayes, was a successful orthopedic surgeon. My mother, Linda Hayes, was a real estate executive who specialized in luxury properties. My older brother Marcus was a corporate lawyer, and my younger sister Jennifer was a marketing director for a Fortune 500 company. I was the one who couldn't stick to anything. After graduating from West Point, which my family saw as a respectable but temporary phase, I seemed to drift between various military assignments that they couldn't understand or respect. To them, it looked like I was bouncing between dead-end positions in an organization they viewed as a stepping stone to better things, not a destination in itself. What they didn't know was that every assignment change was actually a promotion into increasingly classified roles. The quote desk job at the Pentagon was actually a position in strategic command. The quote overseas consulting work was coordinating joint military operations with NATO allies. The training programs I attended were advanced courses in nuclear strategy, international warfare, and crisis management at levels most military officers never reached. The hardest part wasn't the secrecy or the pressure of my actual responsibilities. It was watching my family's growing disappointment in what they saw as my inability to transition to civilian success. At family gatherings, while Marcus discussed his latest corporate mergers and Jennifer shared stories about her marketing campaigns, I had to deflect questions about my career progress, with vague references to ongoing military assignments and exploring opportunities. My father's concern was particularly painful. He would pull me aside at holidays and suggest that I consider using my military experience to transition into defense contracting or corporate security. "You're smart enough to succeed in the private sector," he would say, "but you need to stop hiding behind this military career and start building something real." The family narrative became entrenched. Victoria was the intelligent daughter who had somehow gotten stuck in a military career that was preventing her from achieving her potential. While her siblings were advancing in prestigious civilian careers, she was marking time in what they saw as a government job with limited upward mobility. What they couldn't see was that I had already achieved what they thought was impossible. By age 32, I was coordinating military operations that affected global security. By 34, I was briefing presidents on nuclear strategy. By 35, I held a security clearance so high that fewer than 100 people in the world had access to the same information I reviewed daily. But in my family's eyes, I was still the daughter who couldn't transition to civilian success, who lived modestly instead of accumulating wealth, who dated sporadically because I was too focused on a career that didn't offer real advancement opportunities. They saw stagnation where there was actually unprecedented achievement. They saw failure where there was actually success at the highest levels of military command. The collision between these two realities was about to happen in the most spectacular way possible. Living with a classified military career meant perfecting the art of appearing unremarkable while commanding some of the most critical operations in national defense. My family's world revolved around visible success, stock portfolios, vacation homes, luxury cars, and social status that could be displayed and discussed. My world revolved around invisible success that could never be acknowledged or celebrated. Every family gathering became an exercise in calculated underachievement. When Marcus talked about his latest seven-figure legal settlement, I would mention working on, quote, routine Pentagon administrative projects. When Jennifer discussed her promotion to regional marketing director, I would share updates about, quote, continuing education requirements and standard military training programs. The truth, that I was coordinating multi-billion-dollar defense budgets and strategic nuclear policies, had to remain completely hidden. My parents' house in Colorado Springs became a stage where I performed mediocrity twice a month. Sunday dinners were elaborate productions where I had to explain my modest apartment, my lack of expensive possessions, and my inability to afford the lifestyle my siblings enjoyed. I told them I was working in military logistics coordination, which was technically true but obscured the fact that I was actually coordinating global defense strategies that affected international relations. The family Christmas parties were particularly challenging. Extended relatives would corner me with sympathetic questions about when I planned to get serious about building wealth and planning for retirement. Cousins would offer to introduce me to civilian employers who might value my organizational skills from the military. They spoke about my career like it was an extended internship that I needed to graduate from into real professional success. My social media presence was carefully curated to support my cover story. While my siblings posted photos from expensive vacations and professional achievements, I shared pictures from modest weekend trips and generic posts about military service. My LinkedIn profile listed generic military positions that revealed nothing about the actual scope of my responsibilities or the classified nature of my work. The most painful aspect was watching my family's genuine concern evolve into active intervention strategies. My mother started leaving investment brochures and career transition books in my childhood bedroom. My father offered to finance an MBA program, convinced that additional education would help me, quote, leverage my military experience for civilian success. They meant well, but every gesture felt like a reminder of how completely I had to deceive the people who cared about me most. Dating was nearly impossible under these circumstances. How do you explain that you can't discuss your work, that you travel frequently on short notice for reasons you can't disclose, and that your phone might ring at any hour with calls that require immediate classified responses? My family attributed my single status to being too picky, or too focused on a career that doesn't leave room for personal relationships. The psychological toll was immense. I was living one of the most successful military careers in American history, while pretending to be struggling with basic professional advancement. I was making decisions that affected global security while my family questioned my ability to make decisions about my personal financial future. I was briefing world leaders while my relatives offered career counseling about transitioning to entry-level civilian positions. But the deception was absolutely necessary. My family's visibility in Colorado Springs' professional community meant that any knowledge of my real work could create security vulnerabilities. Their genuine belief that I was underachieving was actually protecting operations that safeguarded millions of American lives. Every disappointed conversation, every concerned intervention, every sympathetic suggestion about my career was part of an elaborate security protocol that kept both my missions and my family safe from threats they couldn't imagine. The irony was that their disappointment in my achievements was actually evidence of how successfully I was protecting achievements that dwarfed anything they could comprehend. The first sign that my carefully constructed cover story was becoming unsustainable came during what should have been a routine family dinner. I had just returned from a 2-week training exercise that was actually a classified NATO summit, where I had briefed defense ministers from 12 countries on emerging nuclear threats. I was exhausted from coordinating international military strategies while maintaining absolute secrecy about the scope of the crisis we were addressing. My mother noticed immediately that something was different. "Victoria, you look like you haven't slept in days," she said, studying my face with the sharp attention of someone who had spent decades evaluating people's circumstances. And you've gotten 3 phone calls during dinner that you've stepped outside to take. What kind of training requires that level of communication? The questions were becoming more pointed, more investigative. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My family's concern about my career was evolving from general worry into active suspicion that something didn't add up about my professional life. Marcus, with his lawyer's instincts for detecting inconsistencies, started asking follow-up questions about my assignments that I struggled to answer without revealing classified information. "You mentioned working on logistics coordination," he said over dessert, "but every time we ask for specifics, you cite security protocols. What kind of routine military position has communication restrictions that prevent you from even describing your daily responsibilities?" I felt the walls of my cover story beginning to crack under scrutiny from people who knew me too well to accept vague explanations indefinitely. My family was intelligent, successful, and increasingly suspicious that my professional life involved more than I was admitting. The breaking point came when Jennifer offered to help me transition into the civilian sector through her corporate connections. "I know people at several defense contracting firms that specifically recruit military personnel," she said. "I could make some introductions, help you leverage your experience into something with real growth potential and better compensation." I panicked and made a mistake that nearly compromised my operational security. I told her I was already in discussions with several opportunities and might be receiving a significant promotion soon. It was a lie designed to buy time, but it created expectations I couldn't meet without exposing the classified nature of my actual career trajectory. 3 weeks later, Jennifer cornered me at a family birthday party with information that shattered my carefully maintained fiction. "I called around to some of my contacts about defense contracting opportunities," she said, her expression troubled. "Several people mentioned that someone with your apparent experience level should already be well known in military contracting circles. Victoria, what's really going on with your career?" I stared at her, realizing that my sister had just conducted her own professional investigation into my military background and found gaps that couldn't be explained by conventional career progression. The generic positions I had described couldn't account for the years of service I claimed or the apparent influence I seemed to have in military circles. "Some of the positions you've mentioned don't align with standard military advancement timelines," she continued. "Others would require security clearances and responsibilities that aren't typically available to officers at your stated rank. Are you in some kind of classified work? Are you lying to us about your actual position in the military?" That night, I called my Pentagon liaison for the first time in 4 years to discuss a personal security issue. General Martinez listened to my explanation of the family's growing suspicion and was quiet for a long time. "Colonel Hayes," he said finally, "this was inevitable. Your family is too intelligent and too well connected to maintain this level of operational deception indefinitely. We need to discuss your options, because your current cover identity is becoming a liability." The conversation that followed would force me to choose between my family relationships and my military career in ways I had never anticipated. The meeting with General Martinez forced me to confront the impossible choice I had been avoiding for years. We met at a secure facility outside Washington, the kind of place where military careers are made and broken in conversations that never officially happened. What he told me that afternoon would fundamentally alter how I could live my life. "Colonel Hayes," he began, spreading classified documents across the table between us, "your family's investigation into your military background has created security vulnerabilities we can no longer ignore. Jennifer's inquiries through corporate defense contractors have attracted attention from people who monitor unusual interest in military personnel records." I felt the foundation of my carefully constructed double life beginning to crumble. "What are my options, sir?" "3 possibilities," he said, each word carrying the weight of finality. "First, we can transfer you to a non-classified position where your family's knowledge won't compromise ongoing operations. Second, we can arrange a complete relocation with a new identity, severing all family connections. Or, third, He paused, and I could see in his expression that the third option carried implications I wasn't prepared to handle. Third, we can implement Emergency Protocol 12. Limited family disclosure under extraordinary circumstances. It's never been used for someone at your operational level, but your family's professional backgrounds and security clearance eligibility make it theoretically possible. The idea was both terrifying and appealing. After years of disappointing the people I loved most, the possibility of finally sharing some version of the truth felt like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating. But it also meant exposing them to risks I had spent my entire career protecting them from. That night, I sat in my secure apartment, the same modest living space my family pitied me for occupying, which was actually a sophisticated safe house with military-grade security systems, and tried to imagine explaining to my parents that their underachieving daughter was actually one of the highest-ranking military strategists in the country. The decision was forced on me 2 days later when my father scheduled what he called a serious family discussion. He had coordinated with Marcus and Jennifer to address what they believed were significant problems in my life that required immediate intervention. They thought they were helping me confront my career failures. In reality, they were about to create a security crisis that could compromise national defense operations. The intervention took place in my father's study, surrounded by his medical degrees and professional awards. The irony was suffocating. I was about to be lectured about professional achievement by people who had no comprehension of what I had actually achieved at levels they couldn't imagine. "Victoria," my father began, his voice carrying years of accumulated disappointment. "We love you too much to watch you waste your potential. Jennifer has discovered inconsistencies in your military background that suggest you're either struggling with problems you won't discuss, or you're involved in something you can't tell us about." The accuracy of his assessment was startling. My father had essentially described the exact situation, but he framed it as the worst-case scenario rather than the reality I had been living for years. "We've made some calls," Marcus added, pulling out his own folder of documents. "We've researched civilian career transition programs specifically designed for military officers. We've also arranged for you to meet with several corporate recruiters who specialize in defense contracting. This fantasy military career has to end." I looked around the room at 3 people who loved me enough to stage this intervention, not knowing they were inadvertently threatening military operations that protected national security interests affecting millions of Americans. "You're 35 years old," my mother said, her voice breaking slightly. "You can't keep pretending that this military career is going to provide the stability and success you deserve. We're here to help you transition to something real." Something real. I was already living the most consequential military career in recent American history, but to them, it wasn't real because they couldn't see or understand it. I left my father's study that evening knowing I had 48 hours to make a decision that would define the rest of my life. My family's intervention had crossed a line from concerned questioning into active investigation that threatened national security operations. I couldn't continue this charade, but I also couldn't abandon either my family or my mission. That night, I made a call that violated every security protocol I had ever sworn to uphold. I contacted Secretary of Defense Morrison directly, bypassing the entire military chain of command to request an emergency meeting about a personal security breach that had become a national security issue. "General Hayes," his voice was sharp even at midnight, "explain to me why a 4-star general is calling me at home about a personal matter." I took a deep breath and told him everything. The family intervention, Jennifer's investigation into military contracting circles, Marcus's legal contacts asking questions about my background, my father's ultimatum that I accept civilian career help or face family estrangement. I explained that my operational security was compromised not by foreign intelligence services, but by people who loved me too much to watch me fail. The silence that followed was so long I thought the secure line had been disconnected. When Morrison finally spoke, his words changed everything about my military career. "General Hayes, what I'm about to authorize is unprecedented in Defense Department history. Your family's professional backgrounds, security clearance eligibility, and demonstrated discretion make them candidates for Emergency Protocol 12. This has never been implemented for personal family situations, but the threat to your operational security makes this a legitimate national defense concern. Emergency Protocol 12. I had heard rumors of its existence, but never seen it used. It allowed for selective disclosure of classified information to civilians under extraordinary circumstances, with comprehensive legal agreements and permanent security monitoring. However, Morrison continued, this decision requires approval from the Joint Chiefs, the President's National Security Advisor, and the Office of Military Intelligence. More importantly, it requires your family to undergo the same security clearance process as Pentagon personnel, including polygraph examinations and extensive background investigations. The next 36 hours were a whirlwind of legal documents, security protocols, and conversations that would have been impossible to imagine a week earlier. Morrison's team moved with the precision of people accustomed to handling sensitive situations under extreme time pressure. My family, still believing they were staging an intervention for their struggling sister, received a phone call that changed their entire understanding of who I was. A man identifying himself as Secretary of Defense Morrison requested an immediate meeting to discuss matters of national security relating to Colonel Hayes's military service. I watched my father's expression change from confusion to shock to something approaching disbelief as he realized that his underachieving daughter's career problems were about to be explained by the highest levels of military leadership. The meeting was scheduled for the following day at a secure facility at Peterson Air Force Base. My family would learn that their disappointing daughter was actually one of the most accomplished military strategists in American history. But they would also learn that her success came with responsibilities and secrets they had never imagined. The night before the meeting, I sat in my safe house, looking through family photos from holidays and birthdays where I had smiled and pretended to be someone I wasn't. Tomorrow, they would finally meet the real me, Streising, but I realized that even I wasn't sure who the real me was anymore. After years of living this elaborate deception, the line between Victoria, the family disappointment, and General Hayes, the military strategist, had become so blurred that I wondered if I could successfully integrate these two identities without destroying both. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, was about to be tested in ways no military training had prepared me for. The secure briefing room at Peterson Air Force Base had hosted foreign defense ministers, NATO commanders, and heads of state during critical international crises. But it had never hosted a family intervention disguised as a national security briefing. When my parents, Marcus and Jennifer, walked through those reinforced doors, they entered a world I had never been able to share with them, and a conversation that would either save our relationship or destroy it forever. Secretary of Defense Morrison sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the director of military intelligence. The walls displayed maps and screens that had been carefully sanitized of classified information, but the room's authority was unmistakable. This wasn't a corporate conference room or a medical facility. This was where decisions were made that affected global military strategy. Dr. and Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Hayes, Ms. Hayes, Morrison began, using their formal titles to establish the gravity of the situation. Thank you for coming. What we're about to discuss requires absolute confidentiality and will fundamentally change your understanding of Colonel Hayes's military service. I watched my family's expressions shift from confusion to concern to something approaching fear. They had come here expecting to discuss my career problems, not to be briefed by the Secretary of Defense about matters of national security. Your daughter, General Victoria Hayes, is one of our most critical military assets, Morrison continued. For the past 8 years, she has been conducting classified strategic operations at the highest levels of national defense priority. Her work has prevented multiple international conflicts and coordinated defense strategies that have maintained global stability during increasingly dangerous geopolitical situations. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's face went through a spectrum of emotions: disbelief, recognition, and then something I had never seen before. Genuine awe mixed with horror at the implications of what he was learning. The logistics coordination work you've been questioning, Morrison explained, was cover for operations that required her to coordinate multinational military responses, develop nuclear strategy protocols, and manage defense budgets that exceed the GDP of most countries. The training programs she attended were advanced strategic command courses available to fewer than 50 officers worldwide. Marcus, with his lawyer's instincts for detail, was the first to find his voice. You're saying Victoria has been working at the Pentagon this entire time? That everything she's told us about her military career has been deliberate misdirection? Not misdirection, Morrison corrected. Operational security. General Hayes has been protecting not only her own safety and the safety of her operations, but frankly, your family's safety. Your professional visibility in Colorado Springs makes you potential targets for foreign intelligence services seeking to compromise high-level military personnel. My mother, who had spent years worrying about my financial stability and career prospects, looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. "Victoria," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is this true? Are you actually a general?" This was the moment I had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. After years of disappointing the people I loved most, I was finally able to tell them the truth, but that truth came with implications none of us were prepared to handle. "Yes," I said simply, "I'm a 4-star general. I command strategic operations that affect national security at the highest levels. The career you've been worried about me not building, I've been building it at levels that require security clearances held by fewer than 100 people in the country." The weight of 8 years of deception hung in the room like smoke from a controlled demolition. My family was processing the fact that their underachieving daughter was actually one of the highest-ranking military officers in American history, while simultaneously realizing that everything they thought they knew about me had been carefully constructed operational security. What happened next shattered every assumption I'd made about my family's capacity to handle the truth. Morrison's revelation should have ended with relief, understanding, and reconciliation. Instead, it triggered the most devastating confrontation of my life, as my family struggled to process not just what I did for a living, but the profound implications of 8 years of systematic deception. The immediate aftermath of the briefing was silence so complete I could hear the ventilation system cycling through the secure facility. Then my father stood up, his face flushed with an emotion I couldn't identify: anger, betrayal, or something more complex. "You let us think you were failing," he said, his voice shaking with intensity. "For 8 years we worried about you, tried to help you, felt ashamed of you at family gatherings. You sat at our dinner table and let us treat you like a child who couldn't get her life together while you were commanding nuclear strategy?" My mother's reaction was even worse. "I offered to pay for career counseling, Victoria. I thought you were depressed, struggling, possibly having some kind of breakdown. Do you have any idea what that did to me as your mother? Watching what I thought was my daughter wasting her potential?" The hurt in her voice was devastating. I had anticipated that revealing my true rank would bring pride and relief. Instead, it had unleashed years of accumulated parental anguish that I had unknowingly caused through my necessary deception. Jennifer's response was swift and cutting. "How much of your life has been a lie? The apartment, the finances, the relationships that didn't work out, was any of that real? Or have you been manipulating us for nearly a decade?" "The emotions were real," I said, trying to explain something that had no precedent in normal family relationships. "The love, the relationships, the time we spent together, that was all genuine. Only the professional details were classified." "Only the professional details?" Marcus's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had discovered a fundamental betrayal. "You let Dad offer to finance graduate school when you probably make more money than all of us combined. You let Jennifer try to network for you in defense contracting when you outrank most Pentagon officials. You made us feel sorry for you." The conversation spiraled into territory I hadn't prepared for. Instead of pride in my achievements, they felt manipulated by my secrecy. Instead of understanding the necessity of my classified status, they focused on the emotional damage of believing their daughter was struggling when she was actually succeeding at the highest levels of military command. Morrison, who had remained silent during this family confrontation, finally intervened. "I understand this is difficult, but I need to explain the security implications going forward. Your knowledge of General Hayes's true role now makes you potential intelligence targets. You'll need to undergo security clearance processes, sign confidentiality agreements, and submit to ongoing monitoring." This revelation made everything exponentially worse. Not only had I deceived them for 8 years, but my deception now required them to alter their own lives to accommodate my security needs. They were being forced into my classified world whether they wanted to be there or not. My father's next words cut deeper than any combat injury I'd sustained during classified operations. "We need time to process this," he said, not looking at me. "I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't know if I can trust anything you've told us about anything else in your life." The meeting ended with my family walking out of Peterson Air Force Base more estranged from me than they had ever been, despite finally knowing the truth about my career. My attempt to save both my family relationships and my military service had potentially destroyed both. That night, Morrison called me with news that made everything infinitely worse. "General Hayes, I'm afraid there's been a development. Your family's emotional reaction to the disclosure has created security concerns. The psychological evaluation team is recommending restrictions on your command authority until we can assess whether this personal situation compromises your ability to maintain operational compartmentalization. 8 years of perfect operational security, destroyed by the people who loved me most." The psychological evaluation that followed was the most invasive process I had ever endured, and I had been interrogated by hostile foreign intelligence services during classified missions. Dr. Sarah Walsh, the Pentagon's chief military psychologist, spent 4 days dissecting every aspect of my family relationships, my emotional compartmentalization abilities, and my capacity to maintain operational security while under severe personal stress. "General Hayes," she said during our final session, "your family's reaction has created unprecedented psychological pressure on your command identity. The question isn't whether you're mentally stable. It's whether you can continue to function effectively as a strategic commander when the people you care about most now view your core professional identity as a fundamental betrayal." The evaluation concluded with a recommendation that destroyed everything I had worked to build: temporary suspension from active command pending resolution of personal security concerns that may compromise operational effectiveness and strategic decision-making capabilities. For the first time in 8 years, I was benched. The strategic operations unit I had built and commanded was reassigned to another general. The international military relationships I had spent years developing were handed over to officers who didn't understand the nuanced diplomatic networks I had cultivated. I was relegated to administrative oversight and psychological monitoring while my family refused to speak to me and my military career hung in limbo. But the personal consequences were even more devastating than the professional ones. My family's reaction had shattered my understanding of who I was and what I had been fighting for. I had spent 8 years protecting them from the truth, believing I was shielding them from danger and worry. Instead, I had caused them to question everything about our relationship and my fundamental character. The breaking point came when Marcus sent me a formal cease and desist letter, written on his law firm's letterhead, demanding that I have no contact with the family until I could, quote, "demonstrate a commitment to honesty that matches your commitment to national security." He was treating me like a hostile legal adversary rather than his sister. Tucci, Jennifer, was more direct. She called me once, 4 weeks after the Pentagon disclosure, to tell me that our parents were considering whether to attend our nephew's graduation if I was going to be there. "They don't know how to be around you," she said. "They don't know what else you've lied about, what conversations they can't have anymore, what parts of your life are classified versus genuine." My mother's reaction was the most devastating. She sent me a handwritten note that simply said, "I need time to grieve the daughter I thought I raised before I can learn to accept the general you actually are." The irony was crushing. I had spent my entire adult life believing that my family's disappointment in me was the price I paid for serving my country at the highest levels. Now I discovered that my family's pride in me, if they could ever feel it, would require them to fundamentally reimagine who I was as a person and forgive what they saw as years of systematic deception. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, my suspension became a cautionary tale about the personal costs of classified military service. Other high-ranking officers watched my situation unfold as an object lesson about what happened when operational security and family relationships collided at the highest levels of command. My career, which had been built on the principle that personal sacrifice was necessary for national security, was being destroyed by the very people I had sacrificed the most to protect. Dr. Walsh's weekly evaluations continued. Each session focused on whether I could rebuild the emotional compartmentalization that had been destroyed by my family's rejection. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. Could I be an effective strategic military commander if the people closest to me viewed my core professional achievements as evidence of fundamental dishonesty? The answer would come from an unexpected source: my nephew's graduation party, where my family would be forced to decide whether they could bear to be in the same room with me. I decided to attend my nephew's graduation party, knowing it might be the last time I would see my family as their daughter, rather than as a stranger who happened to share their DNA. The decision wasn't about reconciliation. It was about closure. I needed to see them one final time before accepting that my military career had cost me the only personal relationships that had ever anchored me to something beyond national service. The party was held at my brother's house in Colorado Springs, with a view of Cheyenne Mountain where some of my most classified work had taken place. I arrived wearing civilian clothes that felt foreign after months of administrative uniform duty, knowing that I was probably walking into my final family gathering as a member of the Hayes family, rather than as an outsider they tolerated out of obligation. My family's reaction to seeing me was exactly what I had expected: polite acknowledgement, careful distance, and conversations that avoided any topic that might remind them of the fundamental deception that had defined our relationship for 8 years. I was a familiar stranger, someone they recognized but no longer trusted or understood. I spent the first hour standing alone near the dessert table, watching Marcus and Jennifer interact with extended family while avoiding any meaningful contact with me. Relatives who didn't know about the Pentagon disclosure continued to offer sympathetic encouragement about my career prospects, unaware that they were talking to someone who had been suspended from one of the highest command positions in the U.S. military. But then something unprecedented happened. During the gift opening ceremony, while my nephew was unwrapping presents and giving his graduation speech about family support, my father's phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated an emergency call. He stepped outside to answer it, and I could see through the window that his expression was changing from confusion to alarm. When he came back inside, he was looking directly at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not disappointment or concern, but urgent need. "Victoria," he said, his voice cutting through the party chatter. "That was Secretary Morrison. He needs to speak with you immediately. There's some kind of international crisis developing." The phone call that followed took place in my brother's study, with my entire family listening as Secretary Morrison briefed me on a developing situation that required immediate strategic response. A coalition of hostile nations had launched coordinated cyber attacks against NATO defense systems, and the assault was sophisticated enough to suggest state-level military planning. "General Hayes," Morrison's voice carried the weight of global crisis, "we need you to resume active command immediately. This cyber warfare operation is using methodologies that match intelligence patterns you identified in your previous strategic assessments. We need someone who understands both the technological vulnerabilities and the international political implications to coordinate our response." What he was telling me was that my specialized knowledge, the expertise I had developed through years of classified work that my family couldn't understand, was now essential for responding to a crisis that could escalate into international warfare. My suspension was being lifted not because my personal situation had been resolved, but because the threat was too severe to handle without my specific strategic background. "General Hayes," Morrison continued, "we need you to coordinate a multinational defense response within the next 6 hours. This requires someone with your operational background and your understanding of the specific adversarial networks involved. Are you prepared to resume active command?" I looked around my brother's study at my family, these people who had spent months questioning my honesty and my priorities, and realized they were hearing for the first time not just what I did, but why it mattered. This wasn't about career success or professional achievement. This was about preventing conflicts that could affect millions of lives. "I'm ready, sir," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. But as I hung up the phone, something had fundamentally changed in the room. My family was no longer looking at me as the daughter who had deceived them. They were looking at me as the person their country had called upon when the situation was too critical for anyone else to handle. My father spoke first, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard directed at me before. "What do you need from us, General?" The operation that followed lasted 18 hours and prevented what military analysts later called the most sophisticated cyber warfare attack in modern history. Using strategic networks I had spent years developing and defense protocols I had created through classified international collaborations, we coordinated a multinational response that neutralized attacks on critical infrastructure across 12 countries. By dawn, we had identified and disabled cyber weapons that could have crippled global financial systems and military communications networks. But the real transformation came when I returned to my brother's house at 7 a.m., still wearing the same civilian clothes but now carrying the weight of having prevented an international crisis. My family had spent the entire night watching news reports about a cybersecurity situation, without fully understanding that their disappointing daughter was the one coordinating the global military response. My father was the first to speak when I walked back into the house. "We saw Secretary Morrison on the news," he said, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard before. He mentioned the operation was commanded by one of their most experienced strategic generals. "When you didn't come back last night, we started to truly understand." What followed was the conversation I had imagined but never believed would actually happen. For the first time in 8 years, I was able to tell my family not just what I did for work, but why it existed at the level it did. I explained that the cyber warfare methods used in that night's attack were based on threat assessments I had developed, that the international military relationships we leveraged were ones I had spent years cultivating, that my routine Pentagon work had actually been building the very defense frameworks that prevented global conflict. "The modest apartment you thought was evidence of career failure," I said, looking directly at my mother. "It's a secure facility designed to protect classified communications." The relationships that didn't work out, they ended because dating someone in my position requires security clearances and lifestyle restrictions that most people can't handle. The financial concerns you had? I've been maintaining operational security that required appearing unsuccessful while actually commanding budgets larger than most countries' entire defense spending. My mother's reaction was everything I had hoped for during 8 years of disappointing her. "You prevented international warfare," she said, her voice filled with something I had never heard directed at me before: awe. "While we were worried about your career prospects, you were literally maintaining global stability." Marcus, with his lawyer's precision for understanding implications, asked the question that mattered most: "How many crises have you handled that we never knew about?" I looked around at my family, these people who had spent years pitying me while I served at the highest levels of international military strategy, and gave them the answer I had never been able to share. Conservative estimate? Over the past 8 years, operations I've commanded or contributed to have prevented 14 potential international conflicts, neutralized cyber attacks on 7 different continents, and coordinated defense strategies that have maintained global stability during the most dangerous geopolitical period since the Cold War. The strategic frameworks I've developed are being used by NATO allies to prevent conflicts that could affect hundreds of millions of lives. The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence that had greeted Morrison's initial disclosure. This was reverence, recognition, and something approaching profound respect for the scope of what their failure daughter had actually accomplished. Jennifer was the first to understand the broader implications. "You've been protecting all of us," she said. "Not just our country, the entire international system. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time we worried about your future, you were actually the one securing everyone's future." 1 year later, I received the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combat decoration the military can award. The ceremony was classified, but my family was there, cleared, briefed, and finally able to witness recognition for achievements they could never have imagined when they thought I was their disappointing daughter. Today, when young military officers ask me about the personal costs of classified service, I tell them the truth. Sometimes the people who love you most will be the last to understand your worth, not because they don't care, but because the most important work often happens in classified spaces where love can't see. My family spent 8 years thinking I was their failure. I spent 8 years believing their disappointment was the price of my service. We were both wrong. Their disappointment was temporary, but the conflicts I prevented, the stability I helped maintain, and the international security I helped build, that's permanent. Sometimes the greatest sacrifice isn't giving up the people you love, but letting them think you're not worth loving until the moment when your country needs what you've built, and they finally understand that everything you sacrificed was protecting everything they held dear. The woman they called a failure turned out to be the one preventing the failures that could have destroyed everything they valued about their world. When the White House Situation Room went silent, and they said, "General, your orders?" my family finally understood that their disappointment had been guarding one of their country's greatest assets. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.